welcome to Fort Lowell Park on the north central edge of Tucson, Arizona. Site of the former Fort Lowell, an Army post active from 1873 to 1891, and supposed site of a terrible medical mistake. But before we get into the macabre details, let's put this story into an historical context. The Civil War created a huge military vacuum in the territories of New Mexico and Arizona, which the Apaches took advantage of in a terrible way. Tucson newspaperman and historian Don Shelley neatly summed the situation up with the title of his 1968 book, Vast Domain of Blood. Many of the streets in downtown Tucson, like Pennington and Cushing, are named after early settlers and military men killed by the Apaches. In 1866, the Army established Camp Lowell here at what is now Armory Park in downtown Tucson. Camp Lowell was nothing more than tents and a large ramada that provided a modicum of shade. Unfortunately, its closeness to Tucson caused problems for both soldiers and civilians. The main civilian complaint was that the soldiers were rowdy. Saloonkeeper George Hand created what is now a well-known map of Tucson in the 1870s that shows a plethora of drinking establishments, opium dens, and sporting houses, an archaic euphemism for a place that combines gambling and prostitution. The Birdcage Theater and Tombstone would fall into this category. The enlisted men were no doubt keeping the local economy afloat, so you have to wonder just how rowdy they had to get before their money was no longer appreciated. Well, there's two sides to every relationship. The Army's complaint lay in Tucson's charms, namely the saloons, opium dens, and sporting houses. The absolute deal breaker for the Army, however, was that soldiers started dropping like flies, and not from whiskey, opium, and venereal disease, though these undoubtedly took their toll. The water table in Tucson was once such that it was fairly easy to dig a well by hand and hit water a short distance from the surface. This propinquity put the water table, unfortunately, in outhouse range. The water the soldiers were using was severely compromised by fecal bacteria. Records for the Camp Lowell period showed that many of the enlisted men were Irish immigrants, decidedly on the short side even for the time period, no doubt having been born during the potato famine, and that their lives had been cut short by dysentery. In 1873, Major Charles Bendier was tasked with finding new digs for the Army in the Tucson area. His choice was a spot near the confluence of the Tanqueverde and Pantano Creeks where they form the Rio River. Bendier was an amateur ornithologist. Bendier's thrasher is named in his honor. In choosing the site for the future Fort Lowell, Bendier managed to kill two birds with one stone. The soldiers would now be 7 miles from all the sporting events in Tucson, and no longer would they be dropping dead from filthy drinking water, though, as we shall soon see, they would find other ways to drop dead. Fort Lowell ended up becoming a major supply post during the Apache conflict. The quartermaster compound still stands on the northwest corner of Fort Lowell and Craycroft and is open to the public during Fort Lowell Day in February. The next most prominent structure is the post hospital, the remains of which stands under protective ramada in Fort Lowell Park itself. This structure plays an important role in the story that's about to follow. The handsome couple in this picture are Dick and Ruthie Dunham, and the skinny tie puts this moment in time squarely in the 60s. Dick was a friend of my father's and belonged to a very old Tucson family. One of my earliest memories is of Dick sitting on the couch in his dark and slightly creepy house on Prince Road, telling a story about a soldier that had been buried alive. Needless to say, the story stuck in my mind. Many years later, I decided to investigate. The story begins here at the Cavalry Corral, when on 6 January 1887, Private James Deviney of A Troop, 4th Cavalry, is assigned to a work detail. Now, prior to mechanized vehicles, the Army's main conveyance for work purposes was the mule. On this fateful January day in 1887, Private James Deviney was assigned a mule, and he was driving this mule when suddenly he was kicked in the head. Deviney is taken from the cavalry corral across the parade ground to the post hospital, where the post surgeon, declares him dead. This is Fort Lowell's sister post, Fort Huachuca, 75 miles away, as seen in 1894. When this photograph was taken, Fort Lowell was already 3 years gone. Now, had Fort Lowell survived the Congressional Budget Acts, there'd probably be no story. But this is where things start to get a little weird. So how does Dick Dunham fit into this story? Well, as it turns out, Dick's grandfather, David Dunham, was actually a squatter on post for many years. Now, as I understand it, his presence was tolerated by the Army because he had a farm there and he provided things like eggs and vegetables. So, when the post closes down in 1891, the Army needed somebody to move the graves from the Fort Lowell Cemetery. David Dunham wins the contract. Now, when David Dunham gets the grave of Private James Deviney, he decides to pop a top. Now, I don't mean he decided to have a cold one. He decides to open Deviney's coffin, and what he finds inside shocks him. From the general appearance and position of the body, David Dunham was convinced that Private James Deviney had been buried alive. By the 1890s, newspaper syndication was very much a thing, and this story of the soldier buried alive made it into every major newspaper in the country. Now, was Deviney actually buried alive? No, I don't think so. And here's my reasoning. Now, was the post surgeon so incredibly incompetent that he mistakenly declared a living man dead? I doubt it. I imagine someplace on Deviney's head there was a divot the size of a mule hoof. Well, what about the odd position of the body? Well, I have no doubt whatsoever that the body was moving in the grave. Bodies have a tendency to move about as they decompose, especially ones that haven't been embalmed. I seriously doubt that they took James Deviney 7 miles into Tucson to be embalmed, only to take him back the next day to be buried. What David Dunham saw when he gazed upon the remains of Private Deviney was simply the result of natural decomposition. This is all that remains of the old post cemetery. David Dunham was under contract not only to exhume the military graves, but also to retrieve any monuments. This includes a handsome obelisk that Deviney's friends chipped in for. It includes the following inscription and now stands in the National Cemetery in San Francisco.